Hi, in this session, we explored how poor employee experience and weaker communication moments can snowball into formal grievances, disputes, and wider business risk. This is a particularly poignant in the context of the new and evolving Employment Rights Act. I was really delighted to be joined by employment lawyer Alex Harper and HR leader Paul Cliff, who shared their brilliant insights and perspectives on where these issues start, why they escalate, and what organisations can do earlier to protect their people and strengthen trust. I really hope you enjoy this conversation. And I'm going to ask you, Alex, first, if I can get you to introduce yourselves and tell us a little bit about what brought you here today and what sort of experience you've got as an employment lawyer. We're very excited to have you with us today.
Well, thank you, Sally. I'm really happy to be here. So just to briefly introduce myself, my name's Alex Harper. I'm a senior solicitor at a law firm called Harrington Carmichael. We're a full service practice, but as Sally has mentioned, I specialise in employment law. We're quite a unique law firm in that every lawyer who works for us has a specialist area of interest, a kind of area of law that they don't necessarily work in all the time, but that they genuinely love. Mine is equal pay and sex discrimination. Those are my kind of focus areas. As I said, it's not something I do all the time, thank goodness, because that would be a sad state of affairs if it were. But it's my area of expertise and certainly where I broadcast my knowledge in terms of LinkedIn. It focuses very heavily on equal pay law and all of the intricacies of that. How I came to work wonders and Sally is through, I don't know if many of you are members of Surrey Chambers, so Sally and I met through Business Women in Surrey. So as part of my sort of advocacy for equal pay, I work, I wouldn't say tirelessly, but certainly hard on building my network of strong women, of which Sally is proudly one. And that's how I've come to you guys today. But I do everything in employment law, and something I see so frequently, in terms of our day-to-day work is employee experiences escalating and escalating. And so I'm really excited to be talking with Paul and Sally about that today from my perspective, which is often the very end and often the worst case scenario. So yeah, looking forward to it.
Thanks, Alex. And we're really, really honoured to have you with us today. And certainly don't want to be putting you out of business, but we do want to be helping our audience to prevent themselves from needing people like yourself and your colleagues. Paul, do you want to introduce yourself and do you want to tell some of our audience a little bit of your slightly unconventional journey to HR and the world of what you do today? And that's a big hint, isn't it, Paul?
It is. You've given the game away. Hi everyone. I'm really excited to be here. It's a really fascinating subject, and it's very topical at the moment for me in my work. My name's Paul Cliff. I run a HR and coaching consultancy called North Face Consulting. We're based in Guildford. We primarily work with SMEs, but we do lots of project work with some bigger companies as well to help them with specific areas of their people and culture practice. The two kind of key things that we focus on, our kind of two gateway products are we help people understand workforce conditions. So, how people feel about work measured by their engagement, their motivation and their well-being and the impact that has on performance and productivity. So we cover the entire employee life cycle, but do it very specifically through that lens. And we also have a program called Positive Intelligence PQ, which is fundamentally the mindset and helping individuals shift their mindset through an act of purposeful practice. We've been in operation for 7 years now. Both of those kind of cornerstone approaches have been part of that. And before I started working in North Face Consulting, I spent 20 years in policing, partly in HR, but before I moved into HR and learning and development, I was the director of forensic services and a forensic coordinator in the major crime team. So some very, very different experiences working in policing, in forensics, but actually there's a lot more drama often in the HR world, as I've come to find out in my time in policing. And actually, what I'm finding now is there's a real kind of congruence again in, I started as a biochemist, and a lot of what I'm doing now is understanding how people and workplaces operate based on fundamentally people's neurochemistry and their mindset and how that influences workplace culture. So actually the two, my two of my kind of key background are coming together now in our work, which is the moment I've been most happiest in what I do, because that's fundamentally what work is about, and one of my big passions is helping people recognize that and helping them replicate that in the workplace.
Brilliant. Well, thank you. It feels like we've got our very own CSI here. But brilliant. Thank you both so much for joining us today. I'll give myself a quick introduction for those that don't already know me. I'm Sally Pritchett. I'm the CEO and co-founder of a people and culture communications business, Something Big. And my mission is, and this is why these two experts are so wonderful to be with today, my mission is to make workplaces fairer, healthier and happier. And I'm doing that in two different ways. I'm doing that through helping our clients leverage their communication to navigate what are essentially lots of tricky topics in the workplace at the moment and lead their cultures. And secondly, by supporting our wonderful, more than 300 now Work Wonders members with free resources, community calls and webinars like today. So that is what I'm doing. And what's wonderful for us all to remember is that when our workplaces are fairer, healthier and happier, they're also much more higher performing. They make more money for all of our organisations, which is typically what our organisations and our bosses want. So today's topic can get expensive. In fact, Alex and I were just talking about that, and I'm sure we're going to come on to that. But so today's topic is, of course, very aptly timed alongside the changing landscape here in the UK anyway of employment rights. And it's an important conversation for us to have, whether we have it now or in general. It's really a critical sort of balance between employment rights and culture and performance, etc. I think we can probably all agree, and we're going to kind of kick off our conversation this way, but I think we can probably on this call all agree that HR and employment issues don't typically start as formal complaints. They often start as a tiny little misunderstanding, a breakdown in communication, something that someone misread the intent. I've been on running another workshop this morning, and we've been talking about word choices and word selection. And sometimes it's just the poor choice of wording that in the moment maybe felt quite harmless, but in reality, it opened a little wound, and that wound, instead of healing, it actually got worse and worse. Today, I would love to start us off by exploring how things snowball. Then we'll move on to how things could be better if we were more considered with communication so that we could prevent things from escalating. And then I'd like us to sort of go towards a place of why there's never been a more important time to sort of shift our mindsets around the role of communication in driving better employee experience. Ultimately, what I would love everyone on this call to do is to reduce the grievances, disputes and sort of battles that they have, because it takes up your time. And I know that every single one of you that's attending today, I'm so honoured that you've made time to join us, because I know you're really busy. And these things like disputes and grievances, they take up a huge amount of time. So let's start with how things escalate. Paul, how do you see things go from what you've called in the past with me, the snowball, to the sort of avalanche? What do you think happens?
I think it's a combination of a number of different missed opportunities. Whether it's a formal grievance or an investigation, or just, I'm kicking off a piece of work today, a cultural deep dive with an organization to kind of preempt the formal issues coming up and trying to understand those. But I'm right at the start of that piece of work, for example, and already I've identified half a dozen missed opportunities to resolve a problem, to resolve conflict, to build clarity, to reduce tension, to help people understand how other people are feeling. There are lots of those missed opportunities, and by the time, and far more exaggerated by the time it gets to Alex, for example. But even by the time it gets to me, I'm often struck by the number of missed opportunities. And we talk an awful lot, don't we, about positive learning cultures in organisations and how we can then help organisations recognise that there isn't that those 6 missed opportunities aren't blameworthy, but there is an absolute learning opportunity there to say, how do we have conversations earlier that build clarity, that make sure that everyone understands where we are, that reduce tension, as opposed to often inadvertently create tension in relationships, in teams, in departments, in individual relationships. And I think we'll go into a bit more detail about what sits behind all of that. But yeah, fundamentally, it's often for me those missed opportunities, and what I've been calling for probably over 10 years now. The snowball becomes an avalanche, and it's much harder to roll it back up the mountain once it's halfway down and it's got momentum and it's gathered loads of extra snow and loads of extra complexity and layers and layers and layers of, this is what was said here, this is what happened. But often I hear things like, when this is the issue right now, and that had the impact because of this thing that happened 6 months ago, or the promotion that I missed out on a year ago, or the pay rise that they got that I didn't get and I don't understand why, or the relationship I had with that line manager when they weren't my line manager, when they were a colleague. And so it's that sort of stuff. Very topical analogy of the snow rolling down. It's gathering not just snow, but lots of debris and litter and various other bits and bobs.
Emotion.
And yeah, absolutely. And it's really hard to unpick further down. And I think that's that's where the momentum comes in. It's really tough to shift.
Thank you. And Alex, will come to you because clearly it is a bit of an avalanche by the time it gets to you. But Paul, before we go on, what do you think that why do you think we miss those opportunities? Is it because we don't spot them, or because we don't, sometimes our managers or whatever, our teams don't have the confidence, maybe they don't have the language, or they feel they don't have the permission to jump in and close that gap? What do you think most often?
I think a combination of all of those. I see all of those. I see manager confidence. I see lots of still managers being promoted to managers because of their technical ability as opposed to their ability to manage. Organizations not really investing in helping managers become managers and understand how to lead. I see an individual kind of challenge. We've got some great stats around the amount of people who are struggling in organizations because of disengagement and imposter syndrome and stress, and that leads to procrastination and avoidance of, often, particularly in performance management, I see just the absence or the avoidance of a conversation, and it usually comes down to confidence or the perception of being overworked. I've got too much to deal with that now. It gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And really interestingly, one of my passions when I speak to organizations is we often forget to invest in the people who are managed. We put all of this impetus and this kind of responsibility on line managers to conduct perfect performance management processes and one-to-one conversations and lead and development conversations. We don't often have that conversation with employees to help them be better at managing that for themselves, because it's a great gift as a manager, isn't it, when an employee turns up and says, I know what I want to talk about in my one-to-one, I understand where my capability is, I'm looking for a bit of feedback here, and this is how it links with where I need to get to. That's a massive gift for a manager, and I don't think we invest enough in helping individuals be better at those conversations. So yeah, I think it's a combination of all of those.
Great. And what I really picked out there is the avoidance. And I think that when we haven't got enough mental bandwidth because there's a lot going on and we haven't got the time, or we perceive we don't have the time, I think it can be very easy to slip into that avoidance. So I can see that. I also hear what you're saying there about sort of what you're alluding to is that adult relationship versus the parent-child. And it's really easy for leaders to switch into the sort of parent-child and then sort of not allow yourself to get back out of that. And that really encourages our employees to act like the child, and then that carries on. Alex, by the time it gets to you, it typically has gathered momentum, emotion, is hard to unpick, and it's got itself in a right pickle. What would you love for when you're unpicking it? What do you think? Oh gosh, if I had a magic wand, this could have been solved further up the chain. What do you see?
I think, I mean, it's a great question. The analogy of the snowball to avalanche is perfect for what happens when you get to the end of it and it's an employment tribunal claim, because it does feel like an avalanche. But I think more often than not, what I see and what I wish I could go back and correct is either sort of choosing a process and using the wrong one, or choosing a process, then deciding you're not happy with that process and doing another one halfway through, or 3 or 4 different things. I think Paul's hit it on the head, really. It's often line managers going not rogue necessarily, but not necessarily following the right process, or and then HR often becoming aware after the fact and intervening, changing course to what should have been the right course, but the damage has already been done because you've proceeded down a course that was the wrong one. And for example, one I see so frequently is people starting a disciplinary process with someone when it should be a performance improvement process. And they just don't want to have the difficult conversations about people being better at their job for whatever reason. They don't want to peel back that layer and understand what's driving the poor performance, and instead will go straight into a disciplinary process. But if you approach a performance improvement plan correctly, that look, it's not a positive experience, and no one sits there and goes, "Yay, I'm on a performance improvement plan. What a great thing." But if you approach it properly, it can be supportive, it can be there to help, and it can be there to get someone to where they need to be. And if instead of doing that, you slam them with a disciplinary hearing invitation, immediately gets their back up, and they don't want to engage in that process, and they say it's not fair, and often it's probably not, because they probably should have gone through a performance process and had the gumption to say what it was. And that leads me on to the other thing. So whereas predominantly I see claims it's the process gone wrong or too many processes going on all at once, the other thing I see quite frequently is people not wanting to be honest. And so labeling something, for example, as a redundancy, because that feels nicer, they feel like they're doing a kindness to someone, but it's not a redundancy. That's not really what's happening on the ground. And you get yourself in a real muddle, because you're trying to say a role that's probably needed and probably going to be replaced is redundant when it's just plainly not. And you've handed someone an unfair dismissal claim, assuming they meet the eligibility requirements for that claim, just because you didn't want to have the grown-up conversation of, you're not a good fit for the team, or your performance isn't where it needs to be, or these things aren't working. It's a very different conversation. It's a very difficult conversation, but it's better than lying to be nice because it's so painful. Most of my claims are employers trying to be nice, and really, if they just told the truth earlier and done it the right way and in a fair way, they wouldn't be in the muddle they're in when the avalanche has landed and it's now in the employment tribunal.
And isn't that an irony for us all to take on board, that we're trying to be kind, trying to be nice, and doing the opposite? And I think for those that haven't discovered Radical Candor, do go look that up and go find the YouTube videos on it and things like that. But, in Radical Candor, which is a format for giving feedback, and it sort of identifies different types of feedback. It's called ruinous empathy, when someone is trying to be kind but really doesn't tell the truth. And I find that such a useful framework to go, hang on, it doesn't really help here. So that's an interesting one. The other thing I pick up from both of you is around difficult conversations. Funny enough, I've been running a workshop this morning for one of our clients, and I've been sharing tips around how to prepare for difficult conversations, how to get yourself in a position where you can say difficult things, share difficult news, etc. Because not all news in business is easy, and certainly performance management isn't easy. But if we can prepare ourselves, if we can equip our middle managers to have those difficult conversations, maybe that would help. I have a bit of a question for both of you, and I don't know if there's really an answer to it, but I'd love to know whether you think there's a particular time which you would see in the journey as you'd go, well, that's the danger zone. That's when things go from a misunderstanding to it gets more serious. Is there a sort of danger zone that you see?
I mean, from my perspective, again, which is probably further down, upstream, downstream, I don't know which way you describe it, than when it gets to Alex, but it's when people stop talking, when people stop having the conversation, because even Alex's great point around, the inappropriate selection of the type of conversation being had. Even in those situations, I often see, this should be a performance conversation, but the minute, even if it's the right process, the minute it becomes formal, there's usually an absence of the informal conversations that have taken place. I do challenge that part around it has to be a difficult conversation. If you've got a trusting relationship with someone and you know that you've got a goal, so we're getting into kind of broader organizational structure and strategy here, but if you've got a shared goal, a shared vision, mission, purpose, you know what you're trying to achieve, and you're not achieving that, the best thing you can hear is some constructive, compassionate feedback about how you can get better. But it doesn't often get given at that point where there is a receptive audience. It comes after that, at some point later. And I know we've talked about radical candor before, and how Kim Scott in her second edition said she should have called it compassionate candor, but didn't think the book would sell. Actually, I think it's a much better title, because that's what it's about, isn't it? It's about, I've got your best interests at heart, and if I give you this feedback, it's going to make you and me and the organization and the people we serve better. And actually, that might still might jar, but actually, I think that can be a good conversation as opposed to a difficult one, but it rarely gets given at that early opportunity. And I think that's the challenge.
I like that danger zone as well, that sort of switch from either sort of stopping talking to each other, or it's when things go from sort of informal to formal, and when we start to kind of sound like we've put it through ChatGPT. And Alex, we're going to talk a lot about ChatGPT in a moment, but I think that's that moment where we've started to lose control of the situation. So if we could get managers to have those difficult conversations informally and get that happening, we might miss some of the avalanche, I suppose. Would you agree, Alex?
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, I think what Paul's basically said is, look, it's even before day one that there is your danger zone, is all the behavior, all the management behaviors, all of the emails that you send in the background, all the WhatsApp chats that go on in the background, even before something escalates into a formal process or even an informal conversation. That's your risk space. That's when I find, when I'm disclosing documents to a party, an email that says, oh, so and so, we just don't like her, so we're going to do this. Just thinking about it in terms of, broadly, if I send this email, if I saw it and it was about me, how would I feel? If people took that as their starting point, and also then added, and also how would I feel if this email was read out in the employment tribunal, which it may well be, we might not end up in such dire straits at the end when it has come to the position where people are entrenched and they do stop talking. And Paul made a really interesting point about going into a kind of formal process, having those informal conversations all along the way. And I think I would just pick on that more and say, I've said, go follow a process, do the right process. Don't do 5 processes when you could do 1. But also, process doesn't mean you have to read off a script. Doesn't mean you have to sound like HR told me to say this, or my employment lawyer told me to say this. You can still be a human, and you can you can still approach it in a way that if someone was having that conversation with you, how would you want to hear it? Now that, obviously processes there and guidance and scripts are useful tools. But if I send a script out to anyone who's asked for one, I will always say, this is the legal basics, but you can take this away and make it sound like you. You don't have to, as long as you're covering these points, it's not necessary for you to literally say exactly what I've written on this paper. This is just to give you a starting point to work from, so you don't feel like you're going in without a clue what you're doing. But fundamentally, it has to come from you, because, chances are in most processes, it's the line manager that's doing the kind of the process, unless they're the subject of the process, and that's a whole other conversation for another day, perhaps. If they're going, they know the person they're talking to. So if they're going to go and through this process and follow a script and they sound like a script, the employee's going to know straight away. They're going to say, that doesn't sound like you. That was written by HR. That was written by a lawyer. That was written by, that wasn't written by you, and it doesn't sound genuine. So, I totally agree with Paul. I think it's not just, it's continuing the conversations, and even if you go into a formal process, making them still feel like a human, and that you're a human going through that process with them, and it's not just a box tick.
And I talk about the word human so much at the moment, and I should imagine we will continue to talk about the importance of human. But I think that absolutely, that concept that you're talking to someone who you normally talk to in an everyday manner, and then suddenly they're sort of talking as if they're a sort of machine or an HR, etc. And I think that will create a lot of emotional response, and we'll go into fight, flight, freeze type response, and people will go, whatever you're doing, whatever's happening here, I resist it because I'm going to have to protect myself. I was just listening to you just then as well about, alter this communication. This is the basics in sort of legal terms, but, bring your own words to it. And I spend quite a lot of time training and helping our clients and their managers, etc., and their leaders on communication. And I don't know where the breakdown goes from being able to talk to our loved ones, our families, our children, our friends. We're quite capable of talking to our mates at the football or whatever. And then we come to work and we somehow lose the use of our human language and our ability to choose our own words. So I've been, quite commonly share different hacks that I would say, one of which is, if you've got a difficult message to share, write it and say it in practice before you get to anywhere, as if you're sharing difficult news with a loved one. Now, I'm not suggesting you then go into the conversation as if you're talking to a loved one, but what it does is it enables you to find your human emotional side, and you go, oh, well, actually, I lowered my voice, I changed my tone, my pace was different, my word choice was different. Why was I so different in this way? And this really helps us, and I think helps leaders find their emotional intelligence, because it is in there. And I don't know why we leave it sometimes at the door. I don't know if that is your experience too, Paul. Do you find that people sort of somehow lose the ability to communicate when they get to the office?
And it's evolutionary. The reason we do that, you talked about fight, flight, and freeze. The PQ neurochemistry, we talk about the default mode network, which is the seat of that survival function. When that gets activated on both sides, and that's the other thing that gets at play here, mirror neurons. If you come with a survivor mindset, the person you're talking to will mirror that in you, and you both become defensive. And the task positive network, which is kind of the thrive process that we go through, which is empathy, the ability to explore and innovate and be creative and calm and to navigate, and think about what's important in life and get stuff done. Those two parts of the brain operate like a light switch. If the DMN is activated, the TPN is turned off, because evolutionary perspective, survival is number one right now. We don't want to do all of other stuff. And I see that in those one-to-one conversations, particularly when we'll talk about it a bit later on around the kind of organizational factors and the cultural factors, but in an organization that knows that it's underperforming, there's financial challenges, there's there's some restructuring going on. People are already in that default survival mode. They take that into conversations. Unsurprisingly, it gets replayed back to them by the people they're talking to. And at that point, we're stuck in that trap of having a child conversation, to go back to your transaction analysis piece, as opposed to an adult. And I think this, how do we maintain that calmness do we develop that ability in individuals, not just managers, or individuals, and create a culture and environment where that feels like it's a psychologically safe space to have those conversations, so we can, even the performance management piece, getting out of this is performance management, so it ends in someone leaving the organization or going to an ET. Actually, the point of the performance management process is to improve performance, get people to be better.
I think we're getting to the heart and the crux of the issue that everyone on this call will also feel, which is trust is, a very rare diamond-like commodity. Not the fault of all of our organizations, but, we are at a stage where we can't trust what we see anymore. Is it AI? Is it not? We can't trust our politicians. We can't trust media. And so, of course, we walk into the workplace and we equally are defensive about what we trust and what we don't. One of the things I often see in employee opinion survey feedback, which of course our clients often share with me, is that they see their leaders as tone deaf, is one of the phrases I see so often, or they say that communication was clunky or clumsy from managers and leaders. I'd love to hear from you both what you kind of, maybe sometimes, Alex, you read something in all the papers that are shared with you and you think, oh God, why did they say that? Or, why that word? Or just do you read things and think, oh, that feels a bit tone deaf?
Yeah, all the time. There's when you have the moment where you get the bundle of papers, you have to say to your clients, right, we're at litigation stage now. Or even we're at the grievance stage, but I'm helping you write an outcome. I need to see everything. I need to know now what the skeletons in the closet are, because we're going to have to address them at some point, whether that's in tribunal or in a grievance outcome or a disciplinary outcome or whatever. So we might as well know now. And you always read, there'll always be one email where you think, oh, why did someone send that? Now, it's not always tone deaf. I think it's not necessarily how I would classify it. Often things are driven out of fear. So they're worried they're going to get sued. They send something to someone to what they think is going to protect themselves, but obviously just compounds a mistake, or compounds, perhaps a process that's going a bit wrong. The other place that I see it coming from more than anything is just a sort of I can't think how to describe it. It's sort of a sort of just, they just don't know. They just don't think about it. It's speed. You send an email, you ping it off. You don't think about how that's going to read when it's read out in an employment tribunal or in front of a judge. And it's a joke that you thought was funny. And then suddenly when you're in a tribunal room and the judge and the panel are all there reading it out and no one's laughing, and you suddenly go, that wasn't funny at all, was it? It's tribunals don't have a sense of humor, right? They've seen it all. They are massively overburdened. Judges are doing 10 things at once at any given time. They don't want to see banter in an email and think it's, they're not going to think it's funny. And probably at the time you did, or you may not even have thought about it and you just pinged it off. And then suddenly 2 years later, or even 3 or maybe 4 now with the tribunal as it is, you're suddenly reading that email in a tribunal going, oh, why didn't I think it through? So that those are kind of, very often I don't see it come from malice, I should say now. It's rare. It's rare for something to come from malice. It does happen, of course it does. Everyone's human, and people have human emotions, and some people just don't like other people for some reason or another. But most frequently, it's either I'm in flight response now myself because I think I'm going to get sued and I think I'm protecting myself, even though I'm possibly compounding something that I shouldn't have said by justifying it even more. or it's just not thinking it through and just sending things off the cuff without thinking. The amount of times I wish someone would wait until the next day to respond to something, or you can see it. It's these emails are always at 17:59 or 10
Yeah.
or 8:30 or 10 o'clock at night, and you're like, you just wanted to get out the door. You were working late. You wanted to get out of the door. You've been abrupt in an email. Someone now has taken that very badly. What would have the difference been if you'd responded at 9 o'clock the next day?
I love that you've ended with that, because what I'm listening to here, and I'm sorry that I don't really have any quick fixes for everyone on the listening, but tribunals don't have a sense of humor, and banter. I think everyone on this call will have experienced at some point where banter goes wrong, and it's I used to say, I'm not running a pub. If you want to have banter, it's not done in my workplace. This is something that we have a sense of humor here. We can have jokes and whatever, but we don't do banter. Banter is a good excuse word for something that's inappropriate. And we actually introduced banter as a phrase and the definition of banter in inductions. So that we can go, let's wipe this out. I'm not running a pub. But the second thing that I think is really hard for everyone on this audience is that you've said something really that struck me, which is, I don't see it often starting with malice. This is accidental, these issues that come out, and so that's really hard. But you also followed it up with such a good hack for everyone, which is, if we can encourage people to pause. So if they are feeling tired, if they are feeling like it's the end of the day, if they're feeling like this is something they just want to get off their plate, if we could encourage them to even set up a send later so that they can give themselves chance to go, oh, actually, I'm not going to say it that way. But I think that's you've also led me, Alex, into our next bit, because one of the things that made me want to run this particular session today is that not only is the employment rights sort of landscape changing, but we've had the entry of our friends ChatGPT and full access for everybody to AI, whether that's your one of choice or not. At the same time as younger generations with different expectations of the workforce all kind of coming in and meeting in the middle to create this enormous situation that we might be in. Alex, do you want to give everyone, I think this is partly, I want you to answer this question to make everyone on the call feel slightly less like it might just be them. But what are you seeing that the clash of these three things are bringing to you?
Yeah, so I mean, maybe I'll start with the Employment Rights Act, because it's going to shock people, but actually, in terms of what we're talking about, employee experience, risk, and snowballs going into avalanche, the Employment Rights Act isn't going to change much for people's day to day. It's probably the one area where you're pretty safe going the same way that you were going before, save for, I would say, one or two kind of touch points. And the first is obviously come 1st of January next year, everyone with 6 months employment service is going to be eligible to claim unfair dismissal. And the cap for that claim has been removed. So there's no longer a cap to what you can claim as part of compensation for that. It feels very scary. It feels like a huge change, because you're thinking, gosh, I'm going to hire someone with the start date of 30th of June this year, and come January, they're going to have the equivalent of 2 years service. I've got 6 months to figure everything out. And it is a huge change. I'd be lying if I said this isn't the biggest employment law change probably in a century. But as well as everything else in the Employment Rights Act, to be clear, I appreciate length of service has been a bit of a moving feast before now. But thinking about it in terms of what we're talking about today, in terms of grievances, in terms of complaints, and in terms of how you handle that process, you may have been in the past a bit more kind of relaxed about doing things outside of a grievance process if someone didn't have 2 years service, because they don't have a fair dismissal, right? So what does it matter? We don't necessarily have to follow a disciplinary process in the same way that we would. That all changes from 6 months less a week in January, because obviously always bear in mind statutory notice, which you have to serve. So it's 6 months less a week, and everyone's got unfair dismissal rights. So you have to follow the processes, you have to go through that, and that's kind of the biggest shift. Then in terms of like the landscape of employee complaints and grumbles and how they experience your company, the other big shift I think that we're going to see is that whistleblowing is now going to specifically recognize kind of whistleblowing about sexual harassment as being protected. Most employers should be on the ball on this already, because the Worker Protection Act last year, which came into force, has put a lot more onus on employers anyway in terms of creating a workplace that doesn't tolerate sexual harassment. So there isn't a huge amount more that you need to do, but if you're not on top of it already from the Worker Protection Act perspective, you certainly need to be from the Employment Rights Act perspective as soon as you can. In terms of AI, that's just been a complete game changer, and I'm sure Paul has seen this as well. In something that would have been a 2-line email is now a 10-page grievance. Something that would have been a claim form with maybe 5 bullet points in it is now a 35-page claim form. And every leg of the process is just longer and more laborious than it was ever before. Now, dealing with litigants in person in the employment tribunal has never been a great experience, I'm not going to lie. It's the one downside of the employment tribunal, well, one of many, but one of the critical downsides of the employment tribunal is that it is set up for people to do it themselves. And as a lawyer who's trained to do it, dealing with someone who isn't is difficult enough. I would say that's twice, if not 3 times as hard now, because I'm not dealing with them. I'm dealing with them not understanding in the first instance, and then putting everything into ChatGPT, sending it back to me, but still not really understanding what they're saying or what they're doing and what they want out of the process. And so that's really hard. And is just going to make, unfortunately, everything more laborious until people start to realize, actually, I need to engage in the ChatGPT kind of process a bit more and actually understand what it's pulling out and what I'm sending out. In the kind of sense of, you asked me so many questions in one question, Sally. The generational split, I don't know. I actually wonder if Paul is more apt to discuss that, because actually, for me, a claim is a claim. We don't see a huge amount of age discrimination claims generally. It's quite a difficult claim to run and not often pursued. So it's, although certainly it does happen. And so actually, in terms of a multi-generational workforce, it doesn't have a huge impact in terms of employment tribunal claims, but I can see that from an employee experience perspective, where Paul might come in, it can be a huge game changer.
Yeah, I'm happy to pick on. I think I mentioned to you, Sally, I did a webinar at the University of Surrey about a month ago on intergenerational leadership and the complexities that's creating in the workplace. With we've got 5 generations working side by side. Lots of stats around people saying that's the only place now, with people living further away from home and multi-generational families, that's the only time they are exposed to lots of different generations. And this perception that's widely reported in the media around all of the different needs that different generations have. And there are some different needs, but the kind of exception is that there's lots of overlap as well, and consistency. And there's a great bit of research that I came up with as part of doing the research and the prep for the workshop around how organizational focus is often too much weighted on the differences and actually creates more organizational tension than actually exists. Inter-individual differences are far more impactful than generational differences, and cause, they reduce more opportunities for collaboration than they actually create when organizations focus on that. So, it goes back to, for me, where we started around how do we create better conversations between individuals in organizations. Primarily, that is going to be line managers with their teams. That, for me, is the primary currency of leadership in an organization, a better conversation, and dealing with people as individuals and supporting them in the right way. And I think that kind of, it blows a massive hole in this whole narrative around, it's really difficult to work in organization at the moment because there's so many different generations working together. Well, that's the strength of those organizations, not a
It's,
weakness of them.
yeah,
So how do we get past that and have better
yeah,
conversations about how
yeah.
we can harness that strength and recognize
Mm,
that every age of life has got something to bring to the workplace, and make that the conversation? Because when we make that the conversation, we look at it with a positive lens, not a deficit lens, and we start seeing the opportunities and the strengths, as opposed to, this is the reason why these people aren't getting on, because they're a, you know, they're a snowflake, don't like hard work, are looking for another job in 5 minutes, and I've been here for 25 years, and this is the way I wanted. That's an individual challenge. It's an individual conversation that needs to improve. Once we
mm.
put a badge on it and a label on it, it creates more reason to divide rather than
I
unite.
I think you've taken us beautifully right back up to the top of that snowball as well, where it's just a miscommunication. I had a phenomenal, I sort of lead, if you like, a multi-generational house in my own family life where we have literally 3 generations living together. And it was a phenomenal conversation when we talked about the phrase tank top, and we all had to Google it in the end because we realized that what to one generation is one thing, it's a completely different item of clothing. You'll have to go and have a look at this because you're probably all thinking, what is she talking about? But a tank top in my generation was a knitted garment that your grandfather wore, and in this day and age it is now a sort of t-shirt with no sleeves. 2 different clothing items as far as I'm concerned. But we had this wonderful kind of communication breakdown. And I think you've just alluded to it there, Paul, which is that, at its worst, we can create these little communication breakdowns where nobody's actually trying to piss each other off or, dismiss somebody in any particular way, but through communication and different words, etc., we misunderstand each other. So if we can embrace that, we can really bring the strengths, of all of these generations coming together. I'm conscious that we want to get on to questions. So I'm just going to try one last thing that I think is going on in most organizations, which is the lens of change and transformation. Do either of you think that the sheer volume of change and sort of uncertainty that our workplaces are going through, is that also adding a bit more fragility to this potentially?
I mean, yes, I mean, I see that. I think I hinted at earlier on, the kind of, any organization that's going through any restructure or financial performance challenges, you're going to create that organizational shift in mindset. Going to be more people are going to spend more time in survival mode than they are in thrive, and therefore there is a greater disconnect often between intent and impact in communications, and not calling that out. And the bit that's really interesting for me is that what you just described there. I was, I'm gonna extend the snowball and avalanche analogy till it breaks, no doubt. I was skiing in early April, and you see that momentum, don't you? You have a snowfall, you actually see it on the mountain where you're creating risk. You can see it about to fall. But of course, what's happened when you sleep at night is there are people up the mountain with little bits of dynamite blowing it up to release the tension, to diffuse the risk. And I think that, how often do we talk about process an awful lot when we're going through organizational change and restructure. How much do we invest in getting people up and down the mountain, releasing tension? So having more conversations that create clarity, reduce tension, build trust. Lencioni's 5 dysfunctions of the team starts with the absence of trust, doesn't it? And I like to turn that upside down and say, well, actually, building good teams then obviously starts with trust. So does that become, if the currency of leadership in any organization, but particularly at times of challenge, is better conversations, the outcome, what they spend that conversation on, should be building and maintaining trust.
I hope you found our conversation useful. What it really highlights is the critical role communication can play long before issues become formal. When people understand what's changing or feel they have a voice and believe that leaders are listening, there's a much better opportunity to build trust, reduce risk, and create better employee experiences. If this session has raised questions about your culture or leadership communication or employee experience, I'd really love to talk to you. In the meantime, thanks, and hopefully I'll see you on one of our future webinars.